Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I come to the floor this evening with a heavy heart, deeply concerned about my fellow Floridians and my fellow Americans who have seen benefits as a consequence of medical marijuana. Throughout this great country, there have been circumstances where states have chosen to experiment and afford their citizens the opportunity to receive medical marijuana treatments. And that opportunity flourished as a consequence of a series of actions, one of which was the Cole Memo. The Cole Memo was direction from the Attorney General of the United States in the last administration not to prioritize the arrest and prosecution of people who are using medical marijuana legally under their state laws, not to punish the doctors or prescribers or dispensing organizations that were assisting in the logistics for that care, but instead to focus our precious federal resources where they could do the most good, to stop drug trafficking, human trafficking, illegal and illicit activity that surrounds the drug trade, to ensure that there wasn't access for minors or cartels or people that would drive a medical practice deeper into the black market. It is deeply unfortunate that Attorney General Jeff Sessions has recently rescinded the Cole Memo, placing into question the very channels of medicine that have helped so many of my constituents and so many fellow Americans. This evening, I'm going to spend some time speaking about this issue, but I wanted to take the opportunity first and yield some time to my good friend, my colleague from the state of Florida, who has been a leader not only on this issue, but on so many of the critically important bipartisan reforms that we should be working on here in the Congress. I would yield such time as he may consume to Mr. Curbelo of Florida.
I thank my colleague, Mr. Gaetz, for this special hour to shine a light on this issue, on the federal government's overreach and unjust treatment of legally operating businesses all across our country. Businesses that operate legally and in compliance with their state's laws and regulations deserve a federal government that respects the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Like my colleagues, I've been disappointed that when it comes to the treatment of these legal marijuana businesses, the current administration, which supposedly respects the federalist model of our government, continues to take such drastic steps to ignore states' rights and the decisions of voters and state legislatures across the country. In the 2016 elections, over 70% of Florida citizens voted to legalize the use of medical marijuana. The two counties that make up my own congressional district in South Florida, Monroe and Miami-Dade, voted in favor of the measure 80.3% and 68.3% respectively. The voices and the votes of my constituents, Mr. Speaker, matter. The 10th Amendment of the Constitution matters. And for those who like to call themselves constitutionalists, the entire Constitution has to matter, not just the parts that are convenient at a given time. In addition to the witch hunt opened up by the Attorney General's actions last week, current federal law also prohibits these businesses from deducting the common expenses associated with running a small business when they file their taxes. Expenses necessary to running a business like rent, most utilities, and payroll. Simply put, this rule places legitimate enterprises, which have been established under state law, at a major competitive disadvantage where legal employers are paying exorbitantly higher effective tax rates. That's why I introduced H.R. 1810, the Small Business Tax Equity Act, last year. This bipartisan bill amends the tax code to allow legally operating marijuana businesses to utilize common tax deductions and credits, thus providing them with tax parity. The federal government should not be ignoring states' rights and the decisions of voters and state legislatures across the country. We must work to afford all businesses selling legal products the opportunity to make appropriate deductions and contribute to our economy and create jobs. And another important point, Mr. Speaker, and again I thank my colleague for taking this time and bringing us together to talk about this issue in a bipartisan manner. The best ally that those who are operating illegally, the drug cartels, the drug traffickers, who do not pay any taxes, who target children, the best ally they have are the policies that the Attorney General has embraced. Because what happens, Mr. Speaker, is that these legally operating businesses can no longer compete, and that people turn to the black market. So hopefully, inadvertently, I hope inadvertently, the Attorney General has actually done a great favor to those who operate outside the law and is punishing those who are actually trying to control this substance, to keep it away from young people, to make sure that only those that have permissions from their states, prescriptions from their doctors, can access this substance. So I am, again, so grateful to join my colleagues tonight to call on the Attorney General, on this administration, on this president, who, when he campaigned, said, I will defer to the states. I will respect the states. And in this case, a state like Florida, which voted for the president, also voted 71% to allow medical marijuana in our state, all the way from Key West to the Panhandle. The residents of Florida deserve to be respected. So I will continue working with my colleagues on this side of the aisle, across the aisle, to make sure that our government respects states' rights, to make sure that our government is on the side of those who want to operate within the law, those who want to pay taxes, those who want to be compliant, not the gangs and the illegal drug traffickers who are celebrating today as a result of this dangerous policy change. I yield back to my colleague from Florida, Mr. Gaetz.
I thank the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Curbelo, for joining me this evening. And each and every point that Mr. Curbelo made wasn't partisan. It didn't lend itself to a conservative or a liberal ideology. It just made sense. It just adhered to our constitutional principles in a way that we can help people without getting the government in the way. And I'm particularly grateful that the movement criticizing Attorney General Sessions for this very poor judgment exercised is not a Republican movement or a Democrat movement. It is bipartisan. And in that bipartisan spirit, I wanted to recognize my friend Mr. Correa from California. I want to thank the many Californians who have been a part of this effort going forward, and I would yield him such time as he may consume.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'm also honored to join my colleagues from across the aisle tonight to talk about Attorney General Sessions' decision to rescind the Cole memo, which has guided the state of California as well as other states in pursuing reasonable cannabis regulation. As a California state senator, we relied on the Cole memo to help craft California's cannabis industry regulatory framework. I personally introduced legislation to regulate medical cannabis that was sponsored by the public safety community of the state of California. We all relied on the Cole memo. We all relied on regulating medical marijuana to make sure it was chemical-free, that it was tested, labeled, and that cannabis was kept away from our children, our neighborhoods, and our schools. I remember working on this legislation, and one day I got a phone call from a Republican doctor who wanted to lecture me about my bill. I assumed he was opposed to the legislation, but you know what? I wanted to hear him out. So I had him drive out to my district office, and during the meeting, he told me about his daughter, young Miss Monahan, who from birth to the age of 10, she was 10 years old, had had seizures. And every year, those seizures had gotten worse and worse. And the medication he had to use to keep the seizures under control had gotten stronger and stronger, with terrible side effects on his beloved daughter. Finally, Dr. Monahan fell across cannabis, medical cannabis. He used it. It was like a miracle. His daughter was getting better, no negative side effects, But then he said, Lou, I want to make sure that my daughter's seizures stop, but I want to make sure she doesn't get high. Meaning what he wanted me to do in my legislation was to make sure that my legislation carried language to make sure that medical cannabis was tested and properly labeled. All what this doctor wanted was medical cannabis for his beloved daughter. And there are many patients like young Miss Monahan that rely on medical cannabis. But she also relies on the proper regulation and labeling and manufacturing of medical cannabis. Attorney General Sessions doing away with the Cole Amendment effectively says to the state of California, you can no longer regulate medical cannabis. This will not be available for the young Monahans of the state of California. I say, please, Attorney General Sessions, reinstate the Cole Memo. Let states do what states do best. Let's respect the sovereignty of our states, and let's move forward, not backward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield.
I thank the gentleman from California for joining us this evening, and his words are a clarion call to sympathize with, empathize with, and support parents who have children with refractory epilepsy and other diseases that lead to chronic and at times unstoppable seizures. There is a desperation in the voice of parents who have children who have these seizures that moves me. A child's eyes can roll in the back of their head. They can turn blue, gasping for air. The gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, referenced circumstances where a parent would reach out and ask for help. And I would yield to the gentleman to maybe further explain how it makes you feel as a policymaker when you've got someone who wants to cut through the normal discord and disruption in the policymaking process, and they just want their child to be able to breathe in the absence of these debilitating symptoms. If you wouldn't mind, I would yield to you for that explanation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just want to add that think about all the progress that we made as a country, as a nation, in regulating cannabis, medical cannabis, how so many states have relied on that Cole Memo to be lawfully abiding citizens, lawful businessmen, and states have also relied on that memo to make sure that their regulatory framework fits within federal guidelines. Much time, energy, effort, resources haven't been invested by these states to make sure that we're following federal law. And overnight, Cole Memo's gone. All that work these states have put together is out the door. What do we tell all these citizens that want to follow the law, want to pay their taxes, want to do what's right under the law, that they are now criminals? This is not right. It's inconsistent with our due process. And at the end of the day, again, these are states' rights. We've given, effectively, these powers, these abilities to the states to regulate medical cannabis. We cannot just turn our back and say, we didn't mean it, sorry. Let's move forward. I don't believe we can return to those days when we would lock up individuals for minor sort of cannabis. We can't go around the streets and arrest people for cannabis anymore. And of course, Dr. Monahan has to have the ability to continue to medicate his daughter. I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back, and I wish his constituents the very best of luck in these trying times. One may reasonably wonder, what does the repeal of the Cole Memo really mean for a patient or a doctor or a dispensing organization? And it presents a series of logistical challenges that could be crippling not only to this industry, but to the very vulnerable Americans who rely upon it for medicine. Today, all across America, banks do not know whether or not their receipt of deposits from cannabis organizations operating legally under the color of state law would subject that bank to some broader consequence, to the oppressive hand of the federal government coming in and creating all kinds of other bad consequences for the people that bank with that institution. And so the result is that dispensing organizations that want to grow, that want to make investments, that want to do research, that want to be able to deliver to fragile and vulnerable patients, won't be able to make payroll, won't be able to fund the infrastructure of their companies, won't be able to do the research so that we find out what strains of cannabis can be uniquely helpful to specific ailments. And so this repeal of the Cole memo isn't merely a circumstance where you're okay so long as you're not being arrested or prosecuted in that very moment. It literally erodes the framework that has allowed people to be able to bring medicine to the doorstep of some of our most vulnerable Americans. That's the true danger here. Confusing policy, lack of clarity regarding the rules. In an area where innovation could do so much good for people, why would we not want the clearest, most rules possible? Why wouldn't we want the highest standards for testing and labeling and research? Why wouldn't we want to introduce cannabis not in a context that could lead to abuse or money laundering or other illicit activity? Why would we not want it introduced in the most clinical setting possible? Approved by researchers, prescribed by doctors, and then used by patients that oftentimes have seen every other reasonable medical remedy fail. I'm a limited government guy. I just don't understand why any administration, Republican or Democrat, would want to place the government between vulnerable people and something that could potentially help them. Again, recognizing the bipartisan flavor of this evening, I wanted to take just a moment to recognize one of my conservative friends, someone who has led in this institution on conservative causes during his tenure here. I would yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Sanford.
I thank the gentleman, and I just wanted to join you just for a few moments to simply applaud the way in which you're raising this issue tonight. I think it's incredibly important because it was Jefferson that actually said that the normal course of things was for government to gain ground and for liberty to yield. Let me say that in English. For government to gain ground and for liberty to yield. And you think about the significance of the 10th Amendment and what it says. Its words are real simple. Those powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This is a gut check moment on the degree to which we really believe in the 10th Amendment and we really believe in a limited federal government. So I'd make, I guess, very quickly 3 points. One, what you're talking about tonight is ultimately about this larger question of whether states are simply proxies, if you will, worker bees, if you will, for the federal government, and nothing more than that. You know, are all decisions to be made in simply Washington, D.C., or can they actually be made at the local level? This issue that you're raising is ultimately not about marijuana, but it's about local voice and local control. And so, for instance, we have an oil drilling issue off the coast of South Carolina, and a number of us have raised it, not because it was our idea, but because every single municipality along the coast of South Carolina came out in unison with different resolutions, different proclamations that said, we don't want offshore, not so much for offshore, but for its impacts in the way that we develop as a coastline. And so this is ultimately about simply this larger question of, does Washington make all the calls? Or is there a state government and a local government and individual involvement that actually is involved in the way that decisions get made? I would furthermore say that this is a gut check vote on the notion of federalism. Federalism is hard. You know, the reason our founding fathers didn't want a king or a queen, but wanted this messy process called a Republican and the Democratic voice that went with it, was because though it's a lot harder, it's a lot fairer. One man, one voice. Not all voices in Washington. And so what I think is interesting is back when I was in a different role at state level, I remember different bills coming across my desk. And different counties, for instance, proposed tax increases. And staff would say, well, you got to veto that. And I'd say, no, counties are free to make stupid decisions. I don't agree with it. I think it's a mistake. But you know, counties ought to be able to have the voice to decide what they want to do. This is that exact same principle at play at the federal level. And by having this quilt work of different experiments in different states and then being what works and what doesn't work, we're able to formulate national policy, not from on high, top down, but from the bottom up. And finally, I'd make this simple point. This is about saying the federal government does not decide the complexion of a local business. I think that what was significant about one of your earlier speakers, Carlos Cabello, H.R. 1810, I'm a co-sponsor of his bill. It simply says you got to treat a local business as a local business. If it's legal locally, then you got to treat it as such. And you can't come in and preempt from a federal level and decide how a local business is going to operate. So for a lot of different reasons, I simply applaud what you have raised tonight, and I thank you for your voice and your very, very strong stand for liberty and conservative principles in doing so. With that, I'd yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back, and it's worth noting that so many of the experiences that make up the people who serve in this body come from local government or state legislatures or governorships. I'm very proud to have served in the Florida legislature. I know my colleague, Mr. Sanford, served as the governor of the state of South Carolina, and we have seen how states can function as the laboratories of democracy. And from time to time, a state may look at another and say there's a circumstance where they've done something right or they've done something that we wouldn't necessarily agree with. And then we can tailor proposals that have withstood scrutiny and review and experiences in other states and try to improve upon them. That is the great federalist system that our founders promised us that remains guaranteed in our Constitution today. Federalism is not some quaint little notion of how government should run. It is the enduring promise that we have a right to live under today. And so I thank my colleague for reminding the Congress that it is the states that are the necessary constituents of the federal government, not the other way around. And it highlights why the decision of the Attorney General to rescind is so deeply flawed, because it highlights the arrogance of a federal government that believes that its policies should always stand in primacy to innovation at the state level. Here, that innovation is helping people. And that's the point that I'd really like to stress. I have met with hundreds of families in the state of Florida and throughout the country who've seen benefits from medical marijuana. This isn't a medical theory. It's not something that people are merely hopeful for. It has actually created a more meaningful quality of life in American families. Why wouldn't we be for that? Why don't we want to champion the opportunity for a parent to be able to hear their child speak for the first time? Why wouldn't we want to give a grandparent some respite who might be caring for a child that has compulsory and reflexive seizures? Why wouldn't we want to help a caretaker who might be caring for a parent of their own suffering from Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or dementia, where we've seen improved research and growing opportunity for progress? The Attorney General's decision is a step backward, but it doesn't have to be, because the Trump administration can step forward and fulfill the promise that President Trump made on the campaign trail to respect the rights of states and to have a non-interference policy with medical marijuana. I've called on Treasury Secretary Mnuchin to issue guidance and instruction to financial institutions that they will not be prosecuted or harmed, or they will not face some adverse regulatory action if they continue to accept the deposits of medical marijuana companies. I am hopeful that Secretary Mnuchin has more foresight than we have seen from the Attorney General's office, and that he will provide this guidance. Mr. Speaker, I'd also ask that the President personally engage. I know the President. I know him to be a man of a huge heart who cares about people. Throughout the Trump family, there's a particular focus on caring for the vulnerable and children who have to deal with complex medical issues. I would hope that the President and that the members of administration would find it within their hearts to take action on this important priority. Let us not allow Attorney Jeff Sessions to limit progress in American families and in an industry that is growing, creating jobs and developing key innovations that can help people. Beyond dealing with this inartful rescinding of the Cole memo, there is broader medical marijuana reform that needs to happen. There is no excuse to maintain marijuana on the list of Schedule I drugs. Schedule I is reserved for those drugs that have no medical value, that can't help anyone, that should be subjected to the strictest scrutiny. Not even cocaine is a Schedule I drug. I don't even think that some of the drugs that are doing the most harm and causing the most deaths throughout the panoply of this opioid crisis are all Schedule I drugs. But marijuana is. It is indefensible, and it is indicative of a dogma, of a lie that the federal government has told to the American people for a generation. And think of the opportunity if we could come together and make some progress on this issue. Throughout the 115th Congress, we've had robust opportunities to debate about our discord and disagreement and to discuss issues where perhaps we won't be able to come together as Republicans and Democrats. But this should not be one of those issues. This isn't partisan. It's not even conservative or liberal. You just got to believe that the role of government isn't to hurt people who are trying to get better or hurt people who are trying to get better. We spend way too much time arresting people for marijuana in the first place. In the year 2015, 643,000 people were arrested for marijuana. That's one person every 49 seconds for a year. 574,000 of these arrests were for possession, not distribution or sale. 40% of all drug-related arrests are for marijuana possession. And this is particularly discriminatory. African Americans are more than 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for possession than whites. Marijuana is a $20 billion industry in this country. If we allow Attorney General Sessions to have his way, we'll drive that $20 billion into the black markets, into the hands of the money launderers and the cartels. And the consequence will be fewer solutions for patients. Marijuana has shown tremendous promise in the treatment of Alzheimer's to slow the protein deposits on the brain. For patients with AIDS and HIV, medical marijuana can stimulate appetite, slow muscle wasting syndrome. It can function as an anti-nausea medicine, as an analgesic, and it can reduce peripheral neuropathy. For arthritis patients, there can be a reduction in certain types of symptoms that could clear people's airways suffering from debilitating arthritis. For chronic pain, we've also seen very favorable results for the many millions of Americans dealing with chronic pain who right now are getting prescriptions for opioids. So many of the prescriptions written for opioids today in America causing deaths, taking away our children, our aunts and uncles, our parents, could be avoided if we weren't prescribing opioids in the first place and if we had a lower impact alternative like medical cannabis. People with cancer have been given new hope. Not only that these symptoms can be relieved through medical cannabis, but that the actual growth of tumors can be slowed. There's really great research. It has been published by the British Journal of Pharmacology regarding the anti-tumor properties that medical cannabis can have. But unfortunately, that research has to be done in Israel and in Europe and in other places in the world. Because in this country, we continue to maintain the indefensible policy that no research can reasonably occur on medical cannabis. As a matter of fact, this very Attorney General and this very Department of Justice have frustrated reasonable efforts to make more medical cannabis available for research, to unlock cures for the American people, and to help American families. Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time I have remaining?
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll conclude with this. I wasn't always a believer in medical cannabis, but I met a girl in my district who was being told by her doctors that she was going to have to saw her brain in half to stop the seizures from firing across. Today, that little girl is a medical cannabis patient. She's traded surgeries for softball games. She's traded doctors for dancing lessons. And she brings hugs and hope and joy to our entire community. It's for her. It's for the millions of Americans benefiting from medical cannabis that I call upon this administration to stop the Attorney General from harming Americans through his repeal of the Cole Memo. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank my bipartisan group of colleagues who've joined me this evening, and I yield back the balance of my time.